Alright, so we installed Playmaker, and now it's time to add some interactivity with it. And so what we're going to do is make a trigger. So we're going to have an area trigger where if I walk within a certain boundary, something happens. So the way to do this, the first thing is we need to bring up our, well actually let's set up with some cubes. So I'm going to create a new cube object, right? And this cube is something we're going to act upon. With the trigger. So I'm going to go and make a second one though, and this one, instead of being acted upon, is going to be the area that we move into. So I'm going to go ahead and just make this bigger. I'll change the size here a little bit. I just need area for me to go into. I'll just do it this way. So there's this big area. Now obviously there's a problem here, right? That cube is inside of this cube, and so we don't want to see that. So before I do anything though, I want to just manage my elements in the navigator. So I'm actually going to rename this one, and I'm going to call this one changing cube. That's my little cube inside the bigger cube. The bigger cube that's going to be the trigger, I'm going to actually rename it T underscore for trigger, and call it changing cube, because now that cues me in when I look over here, oh, this is the trigger and this is the object being acted on by the trigger. So I'm going to grab this, the trigger cube, the larger cube, and the first thing I need to do is well, we don't want to see the material or anything, so we'll go to the mesh renderer and say remove the component, and that'll get rid of all that stuff, and now we have this blank thing. So now if I click off it, I won't see anything, so to manage it I have to go click on it in the navigator. The second thing I need to do for this is actually turn it into a trigger object. So you see under box collider it says is trigger. We simply click yes, and it is good to go. So our trigger is now set up to at least act like a trigger, but we need to actually add some scripting to it. So what we need to do is open the Playmaker window, the editor. So if we go up top to Playmaker editor, it will come up. And I suggest you grab this tab and just throw it down here at the bottom so you don't have to be switching through windows. And we have here where we'll do all of our visual scripting. So it says select a game object, and we need our trigger area. Now we have to right click to add a finite state machine. So I right click in this gray area and say add FSM. And so what this is doing is this is adding, really this event right here is the start of the scene. So as soon as we come to the scene, it will, our cube, our trigger cube will be in state 1. And I'm going to change that to something more descriptive, right? We don't have to change it, but we probably should for our own sanity's sake. And I'm going to call it listener, because what it's going to do is on start, it's going to be listening for someone to enter and someone to exit our area of the cube here, right? So that's why we call it that. And so we need those events, and it's kind of, there's two tiers to creating this event. The first one, the listener, is what action are we listening to? What happens? What is going to be sent to us? And so if you look over here, when I have listener selected, we have this action browser. So I click on this, and in this action browser, you'll see basically everything Playmaker has built into it that you could do, right? Do you want to do something with play a movie or something? All these different things. What we want for us is one called trigger event. So I'm just going to type in the top here, trigger. It'll show me trigger event. I'll double click on that, and it will add it to our listener state that we're going to have this event. And so this is we're going to actually need 2 of these trigger events, so we can add multiple actions. So I'm going to go back to the browser action and get another trigger event. So now I have 2. All I did was double click on it again. I can close that down. And so our first one, right, we want the trigger to be on trigger entered. As soon as someone enters this, we're going to run something. And the second one, we want it to be on trigger exit, because as soon as someone exits, we're going to enter that. So the next step we need to do is then put on these events, these enter and exit events. So we'll click on events right here. And right here we see add event, right? And we're just, again, it's arbitrary what we name these things, but we should name them something so that they work for us. So I'm going to call the first one entered and the second one exited, right? Because these are events. We might as well make them seem more like verbs. And plus that's what will happen. So I added these 2 events, and now I'm going to go back to my listener, and I have to add transitions, right? So when this happens, I'll add this. Actually, before I do that, let's set this up right here. So what event am I going to want to send? Well, on enter, I want to send that entered event that I just created. And on exit, don't worry about these. We're going to do it on our own. We will go to exited. So we'll send these events. So we need to put the transitions for these events to be sent, right? So anytime you see this little exclamation point, you know something's wrong. I'm going to right click on listener, go to add transitions, and whatever events I typed in will be here. There'll be other ones. They'll also enter here in custom events. I don't know why they put it in both places. There's other things like system events. What happens if we mouse up or something like that? But we just need to go ahead and add entered and then add exited. And you see our little errors left us, but we still have these exclamation points, right? Because these transitions expect to go to a new state. So we're going to have to add 2 new states. So I'm going to right click anywhere in this area, say add state, and I'm going to call this one, this is a state of enter, and I'm going to right click again and add a second state, and this is a state of exit. Okay, and so now we have these 2 states, but they're not going there, and we still have these exclamation points. And what we have to do is connect these together to say, hey, as soon as we've entered this, transition to this state. So I'm going to take entered and just simply click and drag on it to get to enter. Exited, I'm going to click and drag on it to exit. So that's great. So now I have, when someone enters it, it will send the enter event. Of course, when someone exits it, it actually won't send the exit event yet because it's kind of stuck in this enter state and it's no longer listening for that. And so what we have to do is create a logic loop. So with enter, what I'm going to do here is add another event that happens, and instead of adding a custom event as we did before, we're going to use one of the standard events called finished. And this just means, hey, whenever we do our thing over here and you're finished, go back to the listener and be listening for enters and exits. So I add that and I grab finished and I just go back to the listener. On exit, I'm going to do the same thing. Add a transition called finished. It's got an exclamation point because it doesn't know where to go. So when you're finished, go back here. So we have our logic loop happening. So right now we're listening, and if I was to play it, it would do the enter and exit things, but it's not doing anything yet. Right now we need to set our do something when we're in these states. And so I noticed I missed one thing that I should have done in the beginning. So let me go to the changing cube and add a material to it, right? So we had made in our thing a red material. I'm going to add this material to that. We should have a start state, basically, of our material. And then I'll go back to the changing cube and go back to Playmaker, because what I want to do now is change that when I enter and then go back to the red material when I exit. So I have entered right here and selected, and so the state, I don't have anything happening, any actions happening in this state. So I need to go to Action Browser. And so I want to do something with the material, so I look for material, and I see one called Set Material. So I double click on that, whoops, and I have entered. Now it's giving me an error because it wants because right now it says Game Object Use Owner, and our owner is the trigger, and it has no mesh renderer, so it doesn't have material. So that's wrong, but we don't want to do that anyhow. We want to work on that cube. So I want to go to Specify Game Object, and this is how we're connecting a different object to our trigger of a different trigger. So I said Specify Game Object, and now we still have errors. What I want is that changing cube, and I'm simply going to drag it right into there. And so now it says, hey, I'm going to operate on that changing cube, and the last thing we want to do is set the material. So I'll click on this little circle right here. And now be careful, some of these are not, like this isn't actually a material. We just see pretty much everything. I'm going to be safe, and I know we made a brick during the course of making this project, so I'm going to select my brick material. And now I need to do that all over for the exit, because right now if I entered, it would turn brick. I exit, it would just stay brick because we're not changing the material again. So I'm going to go to exit, go to the Action Browser, do the same thing. Set the material, change it to a game object, drag the changing cube into here, and this time I'm going to go back to my red material. Let's just go red material, and there we have it. So we've got this whole thing set up. So now let's try it to make sure it works. So I'm going to go ahead and hit play and find my cube. And so I walk to my cube, and as soon as I enter that trigger area, boom, becomes a brick. And when I leave, it goes back to red. Brick, red. So you see how this could be useful to trigger an animation, a sound, an action, play a movie, etc., bring up an info panel, etc., in our open world exploration. So yeah, after the next video, we'll look at even more Playmaker things we can do.